Welcome to Calming Bedtime Historia's channel. Tonight we step carefully through swirling snow toward a lonely frontier fort where icy winds never truly stop whispering through the timber walls. You may think frontier soldiers spent their winters bravely marching through dramatic snowstorms with heroic confidence, but the reality often smelled more like a damp wool horse, wood smoke, and cabbage soup simmering too long over weak fires. What happened when entire forts became trapped beneath snowdrifts for weeks at a time? How did exhausted settlers sleep while wolves circled outside and frozen winds rattled every loose board overhead? So before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. And while you are here, comment below with your location and local time. It is always comforting to imagine listeners scattered across the quiet world tonight. Now dim the lights, and picture yourself moving slowly across a frozen wilderness beneath a sky the colour of cold iron. Snow presses against your boots with every step. The wind cuts across the plains in long invisible waves that sting your cheeks and water your eyes. Ahead through curtains of drifting white, the frontier fort finally appears. At first, it looks less like a military outpost and more like a rough wooden box abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Tall timber walls rise unevenly from the snow. Smoke drifts weakly from several chimneys before vanishing into the storm clouds above. A lantern swings beside the entrance gate, glowing softly through the icy darkness like the last patient star in the world. You continue forward carefully. The snow has already buried parts of the wagon trail behind you. In many frontier regions during the 18th and 19th centuries, winter storms could erase roads within hours. Travellers often depended on scattered forts for shelter, food and survival. Without them, entire trading routes sometimes vanished beneath snow for months. Your gloves feel stiff. Your eyelashes collect tiny crystals of ice every time you blink. The smell of pine smoke reaches you first, followed by the faint odour of livestock crowded somewhere behind the walls. Oddly enough, that unpleasant mixture feels reassuring now. Civilization on the frontier rarely smelled clean. A guard finally notices your approach. He leans over the palisade wrapped in thick furs that make him resemble a tired bear more than a soldier. His beard glitters white with frozen breath. He studies you for several seconds before shouting toward the gate below. The heavy doors creak open slowly. Inside the fort feels crowded immediately. Snow covers the packed earth courtyard in uneven drifts. Horses stand near a stable with steam rising from their backs. Men carry firewood across the slippery ground while women shake blankets from upper windows. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries briefly before disappearing beneath the sound of hammering wood. You step through the gates just as another burst of wind howls behind you. The doors slam shut. That sound matters more than you realize. On the frontier, closing the gates before a storm could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Some forts were little more than trading posts surrounded by sharpened logs, while others housed soldiers, blacksmiths, merchants, hunters, and entire families together inside cramped walls. During severe winters, everyone depended upon one another whether they liked it or not, and many absolutely did not. You notice the tension quickly. Two trappers argue beside a pile of frozen pelts. A tired cook drags buckets of water toward the kitchen building while muttering under her breath. Near the stable, one exhausted soldier struggles to calm a frightened mule refusing shelter. Nobody appears glamorous. That is one detail old paintings rarely mention. Frontier forts often look muddy, smoky, overcrowded, and deeply uncomfortable. Clothing stayed damp for days. Fleas remained common even during winter. Blankets smelled permanently of campfire smoke because nearly every building leaked cold air through tiny cracks between logs. Still, the fort feels alive. You walk slowly through the courtyard while snowflakes swirl around lantern light in soft circles. Somewhere nearby, somebody laughs suddenly. Another voice begins singing a rough folk tune badly off-key. The melody drifts briefly across the storm before vanishing again. You cannot help smiling. Human beings have always sounded strangely cheerful near disaster. A curious historical detail survives from several isolated forts across North America. During brutal winters, some soldiers trained mice to perform tiny tricks for entertainment during long nights indoors. One officer reportedly carried a mouse inside his coat pocket for nearly an entire season. Historians debate whether that story became exaggerated over time, though frontier journals frequently mention unusual attempts to fight boredom, and boredom was dangerous here. Long storms trapped people together without privacy. Tempers rose quickly, gambling losses sparked fights. Small annoyances became unforgettable grudges, yet the same isolation also forced cooperation in unexpected ways. You pass a group of women sewing near an open doorway. Candlelight spills warmly across the snow beside them. One repairs mittens while another carefully patches a thick wool coat. Their hands move quickly despite the cold. Inside the nearest barracks building, warmth finally surrounds you. The heat feels uneven and smoky rather than comfortable. A fire crackles loudly at the centre of the room while rows of rough wooden bunks line the walls. Wet socks hang from ropes overhead beside strips of drying meat. The entire room smells like damp leather pine resin sweat tobacco and something vaguely burnt, probably dinner. You remove your gloves, slowly wincing, as feeling returns to your fingers. Around you, tired faces glance up briefly before returning to their conversations. A man sharpens a knife near the fire. Another writes carefully in a small journal while squinting beside candlelight. Letters mattered deeply here. Mail often travelled slowly across frontier territories during winter months. Some forts received only a few deliveries each season. People reread old letters repeatedly until the paper softened and tore at the folds. The storm outside grows louder. Snow taps softly against the walls, now almost politely. The building creaks occasionally beneath stronger gusts. You notice how everyone instinctively pauses whenever the wind rises sharply. Frontier storms carried genuine danger. Roofs collapsed. Livestock froze. Travellers disappeared only a few miles from shelter. A scholarly disagreement still exists regarding how isolated many frontier forts truly became during severe winters. Some researchers believe forts maintained regular trade connections despite storms, while others argue many outposts essentially vanished from communication for extended periods. Evidence varies widely depending on region and climate. You sit closer to the fire. The warmth reaches your boots gradually. Somebody hands you a dented tin cup containing hot broth salted heavily enough to wake the dead. It tastes wonderful anyway. Outside, the snowstorm thickens around the fort walls. Inside, shadows flicker gently across tired faces, while the long winter night quietly settles over everyone together. Morning disappears quickly beneath the storm. By late afternoon, the frontier fort already feels sealed away from the wider world. Snow sweeps across the courtyard in restless white ribbons, while the sky darkens into heavy shades of grey and blue. You stand near the inner gate, wrapped tightly in a borrowed wool coat, watching men secure thick beams across the entrance before night fully arrives. The wood groans loudly. Every movement feels heavier in the cold. Boots scrape across frozen ground, and chains clink beside the gate hinges. Somewhere above you, loose shutters bang rhythmically against a wall, until somebody finally climbs a ladder to fasten them shut. The guard beside you exhales deeply through his beard. He smells faintly of tobacco smoke and wet fur. His cheeks remain permanently red from years of winter patrols. Without looking away from the gate, he quietly explains that storms like this sometimes lasted 3 or 4 days, occasionally longer. Nobody likes hearing that. Inside frontier forts, time changed strangely during blizzards. The outside world vanished behind snow and darkness, leaving people trapped inside crowded buildings with little distraction beyond work conversation and waiting. Some described winter storms as peaceful. Others compared them to imprisonment. You can already understand both opinions. The heavy gates finally close completely as dusk settles over the fort. A thick wooden bar slides into the place with a dull thud that echoes through the courtyard. Several people pause instinctively at the sound. Safe for now. That single thought passes silently between everyone nearby. You follow the others toward the central square where lanterns flicker, weakly against the rising wind. Snow crunches beneath your boots with sharp, dry sounds. The cold feels different now, sharper somehow. It slips through clothing carefully, reaching your skin in tiny, invisible needles. A cluster of children races past you, despite the weather. One nearly crashes into a stack of firewood before his mother catches him firmly by the collar. She pulls him back toward the barracks while snowflakes cling to her dark shawl. Her expression looks exhausted but patient. Families often lived inside larger frontier forts during dangerous seasons. Soldiers shared space with traders, blacksmiths, cooks, washerwomen, interpreters, hunters, and children. Privacy barely existed. One traveller complained that sleeping inside a crowded fort sounded like resting beside an orchestra, composed entirely of coughing, snoring, crying babies and drunken singing. Cool. That description feels accurate already. The smell of supper begins drifting through the cold air. Salt pork, onion broth, burned flour, wood smoke. Hunger sharpens every scent until even plain stew smells strangely luxurious. You duck inside the main hall beside several freezing soldiers shaking snow from their coats. Heat rolls toward you immediately, carrying the dense, smoky warmth of crowded indoor life. Candles flicker along rough timber walls darkened by years of soot. Boots dry beside the fire in uneven rows. Wet mittens hang from pegs overhead like tired, sleeping animals. The room hums softly with conversation. At one table, two fur traders examine maps stained with grease and melted snow. Nearby, an elderly woman stirs a huge iron pot slowly while muttering the instructions toward younger helpers carrying bowls. Every surface appears occupied by something useful. Tin cups, knives, blankets, sacks of flour, a sleepy cat curled beside the hearth. That cat might actually save lives. Rodents cause serious trouble inside frontier settlements during winter. Mice and rats chewed stored grain, damaged clothing, and spread illness through cramped buildings. Several forts reportedly kept entire groups of cats specifically for protecting winter supplies. Some animals became almost legendary among residents. You settle onto a narrow bench near the fire. The heat feels pleasant against your frozen hands, though your back remains cold from damp clothing. Across from you, a young soldier carefully removes snow from his boots using a spoon handle. He cannot be older than 18. Frontier forts often relied upon remarkably young recruits. Many soldiers arrived with little wilderness experience. Some had never seen deep snow before reaching distant territories. Letters from officers occasionally described terrified young men struggling through their first northern winter while pretending bravery in front of older veterans. A burst of laughter interrupts your thoughts. One trader has begun telling stories loudly near the far wall. His dramatic hand gestures nearly knock over a candle while listeners groan and grin in equal measure. According to him, he once encountered a frozen lake so clear that fish appeared suspended beneath his feet like ghosts trapped us inside glass. Possibly true, possibly not. Frontier storytelling improved considerably after several cups of whiskey. The storm outside deepens steadily. Snow rattles against the roof now in steady waves. Occasionally the entire hall creaks beneath strong gusts. Nobody panics at the sound. That may be the strangest detail of all. People simply continue eating. A notable historical reality about frontier forts involved constant fire danger during winter months. Buildings stood close together and relied heavily upon fireplaces, candles, lanterns, and wood stoves. One accidental spark could destroy an entire settlement while everyone slept. Night patrols regularly checked buildings for dangerous embers or overheated chimneys. You notice buckets positioned beside nearly every doorway. Preparedness becomes habit here. Near the fire, a woman quietly sings while mending thick wool socks. Her voice remains soft enough that you barely notice the melody beneath surrounding conversation. The tune sounds older than the fort itself. Several nearby children slowly grow quieter listening to her. Moments like this mattered deeply. Winter isolation exhausted people emotionally as much as physically. Music, jokes, stories, and familiar routines helped preserve morale during long storms. Without those comforts, fear spread quickly through crowded communities. One peculiar frontier superstition claimed whistling indoors during storms invited stronger winds outside. Historians remain uncertain about where that belief originated, though. Versions appeared across several isolated settlements in North America and Northern Europe. Nobody whistles tonight. The young soldier beside you finally finishes scraping ice from his boots. He glances toward the windows where darkness presses heavily against the frosted glass. Then he asks quietly whether you think the storm will bury the outer trail completely. You hesitate, because honestly it probably will. Outside these walls, the wilderness has already vanished beneath snow and darkness. Roads disappear first, then landmarks, then distance itself. Frontier travellers caught in severe blizzards sometimes wandered in circles only a short distance from safety without realising it. Inside the fort, however, life continues stubbornly. Bowls clatter softly. Firewood snaps inside the hearth. Somebody laughs again near the trader's table. And above it all, the storm keeps whispering against the timber walls while night settles fully over the isolated frontier fort. By the time full darkness settles outside, the barracks already feel smaller than before. More people continue entering from the courtyard, carrying armfuls of blankets, wet boots, frozen tools, and dripping coats covered in fresh snow. Every gust of wind that slips through the doorway sends icy air crawling across the floorboards before the door slams shut again. The room never becomes quiet. That may surprise you. Many people imagine frontier forts falling sonnet at night beneath peaceful snowstorms. In reality, barracks buildings often sounded like crowded inns mixed with workshops, kitchens, and livestock sheds all squeezed together beneath one roof. You hear everything: coughing near the fire, low conversations from the bunks, wood popping inside the hearth, the wet slapping sound of somebody wringing melted snow from wool socks. A baby fusses briefly near the rear wall, while a tired mother rocks gently back and forth beside candlelight. Nearby, two soldiers argue softly over card game rules neither fully remembers. The air feels thick. Smoke drifts lazily beneath the ceiling beams where soot has darkened the wood almost black. Damp clothing hangs overhead in long, uneven lines, dripping occasionally onto the packed floor below. The smell becomes impossible to separate into individual parts now. Sweat, wet leather, pine smoke, grease, old wool, boiled onions, human beings surviving winter together. You settle deeper onto your bunk, which consists mostly of rough boards covered by a thin straw mattress. It crackles loudly whenever you shift position. Comfort remains relative on the frontier. Still, the warmth matters. Outside temperatures may already sit far below freezing. Inside, the crowded room traps enough body heat to soften the edges of the cold, not entirely. Your fingertips still ache occasionally. Tiny drafts still of cold slip through the walls. Yet compared with the blizzard outside, the barracks feel almost luxurious. Almost. A large man across the room removes his boots with a groan of relief strong enough to attract immediate complaints from nearby soldiers. Apparently the smell arrives before the boots fully come off. Several people laugh anyway. Frontier humour leaned heavily toward practical suffering. One historical account from a northern trading fort described barracks so crowded during winter that late arrivals slept sitting upright against walls because floor space disappeared completely. Another journal mentioned frost forming indoors beside poorly insulated corners even while fires burned constantly. You believe both stories immediately. The young soldier from earlier waves you toward the hearth where several others warm their hands beside glowing coals. You move carefully through the crowded room, stepping over blankets, boots, and one sleeping dog that barely opens an eye as you pass. The fire crackles softly. Its warmth feels uneven but comforting. Faces glow amber beneath the shifting light while shadows dance across the walls behind them. Somebody passes around a dented kettle filled with weak coffee brewed dark enough to remove paint from furniture. You drink gratefully. Even terrible coffee becomes magical during storms. One older trapper begins describing a winter expedition farther north where temperatures supposedly froze bacon solid enough to shatter like glass when dropped. Another man insists he once saw trees explode during extreme cold. Oddly enough, that part may actually be true. In severe winter conditions, frozen sap inside tree trunks occasionally expands and cracks loudly. Frontier travelers sometimes described hearing sharp, explosive sounds echoing through forest during freezing nights. Imagine trying to sleep while the wilderness itself appears to be snapping apart around you. The thought feels unsettling. You pull your blanket tighter. Nearby, a woman carefully checks a kettle suspended above the fire, while speaking holo to her daughter. The child watches the flames with sleepy fascination. Her small boots sit drying beside the hearth, releasing little curls of steam. Children adapted quickly inside frontier forts. They carried water, gathered wood chips, cleaned cookware-fed animals, and learned practical survival skills remarkably young. Some frontier children reportedly identified incoming storms faster than adults by observing changes in wind animal behavior or cloud color. Not much childhood softness survived here. Yet moments of tenderness still appear unexpectedly. The mother near the fire begins quietly braiding her daughter's hair while humming beneath her breath. The child slowly falls asleep, sitting upright beside her. Nobody interrupts them. Across the room, however, somebody starts snoring loud enough to shake confidence in the structural stability of the building. That ends the peaceful atmosphere immediately. Boots fly harmlessly toward the offending bunk while exhausted laughter spreads through the barracks. The snoring pauses briefly before returning even louder than before. You suspect frontier patients wore thin during winter. A curious tidbit survives from one isolated military outpost where officers reportedly assigned chronic snorers near doors specifically because nearby soldiers threatened mutiny after several sleepless nights. Historians disagree about whether that story was exaggerated for humour, though complaints about snoring appear frequently in surviving journals. Some human problems remain timeless. The storm outside intensifies steadily. Snow scrapes against the walls now with dry whispering sounds. Occasionally wind forces powder through tiny cracks between logs, leaving thin, white lines along the floor near certain bunks. A soldier casually stuffs cloth into one opening, without even glancing up from his card game. Experience once teaches efficiencies. You notice how routines dominate life inside the fort. Wet clothes move closer toward heat. Water buckets refill automatically. Boots rotate beside the fire. Everyone performs small tasks constantly, because neglecting simple chores in winter created larger dangers later. A poorly dried coat could freeze stiff overnight. Forgotten water buckets turned solid by morning. Loose jutters invited drifting snow indoors. Survival depended upon habits repeated carefully every day. One scholarly mystery surrounding frontier forts involves the emotional strain caused by prolonged isolation. Some historians argue winter confinement strengthened community bonds through shared hardship. Others believe tensions, loneliness, and exhaustion damaged morale far more seriously than official records admitted. Watching the crowded barracks tonight, you suspect both ideas contain truth. Companionship exists here. So does irritation. The fire burns lower briefly before fresh logs crash into the hearth with a burst of sparks. Smoke thickens momentarily, causing several people to cough while somebody opens the chimney vent farther. Fresh cold air slips through immediately. Everyone complains at once. That reaction makes you smile quietly into your cup. Hours earlier, these same people faced dangerous wilderness alone. Now they argue dramatically over tiny drafts inside shared shelter. Human beings adjust quickly to comfort, even temporary comfort. You lean back against the rough wall behind your bunk while candlelight flickers softly across the crowded room. Outside, the blizzard continues swallowing the frontier fort beneath layers of drifting snow. Inside, the barracks remain awake, warm, crowded, restless, and deeply human. The next morning begins with the smell of smoke and boiling onions. You wake slowly beneath heavy blankets while pale grey light presses weakly through frosted windows. Around you, the barracks already stir with movement. Boots scrape across floorboards. Somebody coughs near the hearth. A kettle lid rattles softly as water trembles above the flames. The storm never stopped. Snowstorm whispers against the walls outside, though the wind sounds calmer now. That almost feels worse somehow. Quiet storms often lasted longer. Your breath lingers faintly in the cold air above the blankets. Overnight the fire burned low enough for frost to gather along the corners of the room. Thin crystals glitter beside the ceiling beams like tiny stars trapped indoors. Nobody comments on it. People here treat discomfort the way sailors treat waves. Constant, expected, barely worth mentioning anymore. You sit upright, carefully wincing as stiff muscles protest. The straw mattress beneath you has flattened into something resembling woven lumber. Nearby, the loud snorer from last night still sleeps peacefully, while several exhausted soldiers glare toward him with deep resentment. Miraculously, he survives. For now, the warmth near the fire attracts everyone gradually. Men wrap themselves in blankets while pulling on half-frozen boots. Children drift sleepily beside their mothers. One elderly trapper warms his hands above the embers with the concentration of a priest performing sacred ritual. In frontier forts, mornings often revolved around the fire before anything else. Heat meant movement. Movement meant survival. Without reliable warmth, fingers stiffen too badly for sewing, cooking, repairing tools, or loading weapons. You step closer to the hearth. The smell growing from the cooking kettles feels strong enough to taste before breakfast even reaches your bowl. Salt pork simmers beside onions, beans, and coarse flour dumplings thick enough to stop bullets. Frontier meals rarely aimed for elegance. They aimed for endurance. A cook ladles stew into wooden bowls with mechanical efficiency while muttering complaints about firewood quality. Her apron carries dark soot stains from years beside open flames. One younger helper struggles to knead dough near the table while rubbing warmth back into red fingers every few moments. Cooking during winter storms demanded constant attention. Fires weakened unexpectedly, chimneys clogged with soot, frozen ingredients thawed unevenly, water buckets develop thin layers of ice overnight if placed too far from heat. One overlooked detail could ruin precious supplies quickly. You accept a steaming bowl carefully. The heat spreads into your hands immediately. Breakfast tastes salty, greasy, and deeply satisfying. Nearby conversations rise slowly as people wake fully. Someone complains about frozen boots. Another curses a leaking roof corner above his bunk. Normal frontier music. A detail preserved in several fort journals mentions cooks hiding small luxury ingredients during severe winters. Tiny amounts of cinnamon, dried apples, or molasses became treasured morale boosters when storms trapped communities indoors for weeks. Some officers reportedly guarded coffee supplies more fiercely than ammunition. Honestly, that feels understandable. Without coffee, this room might descend into open rebellion before noon. You glance toward the windows where daylight remains pale and uncertain. Snow still drifts steadily outside. Through gaps in the frost, you can barely see the courtyard buried beneath fresh white layers. Two soldiers struggle past, carrying chopped wood against their shoulders, while icy wind snaps at their coats. The fort consumes firewood endlessly. That simple reality shaped winter life across countless frontier settlements. Large forts required enormous amounts of timber every day for heating, cooking, blacksmithing, and boiling water. Storms complicated everything by slowing wood gathering parties and soaking exposed supplies beneath snow. People rarely rested completely here. Even survival demanded chores. After breakfast, you help carry fresh water from a storage barrel near the kitchen entrance. The bucket handle bites cold against your palms while slushy ice bumps softly against the wooden sides. Every trip across the room leaves wet footprints melting briefly before freezing again near the doorway. One child slips. The entire bucket crashes harmlessly across the floor while nearby adults sigh with theatrical despair. The poor boy freezes in horror for exactly 3 seconds before several people burst into tired laughter instead. Frontier communities depended heavily upon shared patience. Usually, a grey-haired woman immediately hands the child a rag and points toward the spilled water without saying a word. He begins cleaning silently while trying not to cry from embarrassment. Lessons arrived early here. Near the cooking fire, one trader begins discussing stories from northern territories where isolated forts supposedly boiled leather during desperate winters after supply shortages. Some modern researchers question how widespread such practices truly became, though severe hunger certainly haunted remote settlements whenever storms block transportation routes too long. You study the cooking kettles more appreciatively after hearing that. Suddenly cabbage stew sounds luxurious again. The kitchen area grows hotter by midday. Steam clouds the windows completely, while smoke clings stubbornly beneath the rafters. Sweat gathers beneath heavy wool clothing despite the freezing weather outside. Your eyes sting occasionally from ash drifting through the air whenever someone feeds another log into the flames. Still nobody lives willingly. Warmth creates gravity. People drift toward it, naturally lingering beside the hearth long after finishing meals. Stories continue. Repairs continue. Arguments continue. One young woman patches gloves while quietly correcting a soldier's terrible singing nearby. The soldier ignores her advice heroically. His singing somehow worsens. An unusual account from a western frontier post describes soldiers organizing mock cooking competitions during winter confinement. Participants attempted improving bland meals using stolen spice scraps, dried berries, or questionable improvisation. One entry mentioned a disastrous onion pudding that reportedly frightened even the fort dog. You believe that instantly. Frontier cuisine carried risks modern restaurants wisely avoid. By afternoon, the storm thickens once more beyond the walls. Snow taps steadily against the roof while dim light fades early behind heavy clouds. Inside the fort kitchen, however, fires continue glowing bright against the growing darkness. You stand near the hearth listening to simmering pots' soft conversation and crackling wood while the winter storm slowly buries the frontier world outside. Night returns early beneath the storm. By evening, darkness folds across the frontier fort so completely that the outer walls seem to dissolve into the blizzard itself. Lanterns glow along the inner courtyard in weak yellow circles, though snow quickly swallows most of their light. Beyond the gates, the wilderness has become invisible. That is exactly what worries everyone. You stand near the armory, pulling thick gloves tighter around your hands while a sergeant checks rifles beneath the shelter of a wooden overhang. Snow dusts his broad shoulders despite the roof above him. The wind shifts constantly tonight, sending icy powder sideways through every opening. A patrol bell rings once, quietly, not an alarm, just the signal for changing watch. Several soldiers groan softly before stepping away from the fire inside the barracks. Nobody volunteers eagerly for night duty during storms like this. Guarding the fort means standing outside while frozen wind claws through every layer of clothing for hours at a time. Still, the watch must continue. Frontier forts depended heavily upon routine patrols even during severe weather. Guards checked gates, inspected walls, watched for drifting snow build-up, and listened for unusual sounds beyond the perimeter. Storms created confusion. Confusion invited danger. You follow the patrol toward the outer walkway beside the timber walls. The cold strikes immediately. It feels alive tonight. Wind surges across the fort with low howling sounds that rise and fall unpredictably. Snow sweeps through the darkness in thick twisting clouds. Your boots crunch across icy planks while lantern light flickers violently beside you. One soldier mutters that the storm sounds hungry. Honestly, he may be correct. The wilderness beyond the walls appears endless now. No stars shine overhead. No moon breaks through the clouds. Snow and darkness blend together till the world resembles an ocean made entirely of cold air. You pause beside the palisade and peer outward carefully. Nothing. Then movement. A drifting shape crosses the snow briefly before vanishing again behind the storm. Your pulse jumps until the older guard beside you squints and laughs softly. Loose canvas. Probably. Hopefully. The frontier encouraged imagination after dark. One officer stationed near the northern plains once wrote that winter patrols often produce strange illusions caused by blowing snow exhaustion and isolation. Men reported hearing distant voices, phantom bells, or footsteps approaching from empty wilderness. Some blamed spirits, others blamed whiskey. The truth may have involved both occasionally. Your eyelashes gather frost quickly. Every breath stiffens the scarf across your mouth. Nearby, a lantern flame struggles against the wind while snow gathers thickly along the top edges of the wall. The patrol keeps moving. You pass narrow lookout points where guards peer into the storm with tired concentration. One stamps his boots continuously to preserve feeling in his toes. Another keeps rubbing his beard free from accumulating ice crystals. No bard speaks much now. The cold steals language gradually. At the northern corner of the fort, the wind grows stronger. It screams across the open plains hard enough to shake loose snow from the rooftops below. Somewhere beyond visibility, you hear a long, low sound drifting through the storm. A wolf, or perhaps several. The younger soldier beside you stiffens immediately. Wolves frequently prowled near frontier settlements during harsh winters, especially when deep snow complicated hunting elsewhere. Most avoided human activity cautiously, though starving animals occasionally approached livestock pens or garbage pits surrounding isolated forts. The sound comes again, longer this time. Strangely mournful. You understand suddenly why so many frontier journals described winter nights as emotionally exhausting. Darkness pressed against the walls constantly here. Not dramatic danger every moment. Something quieter. A feeling of The fort protects you certainly. Yet the wilderness never feels far away. Snow reaches your knees in some corners now. 2 guards stop briefly to clear drifting build-up near a smaller side gate using broad wooden shovels. The work looks miserable. Wind throws half the snow directly back into their faces each time they lift another load. One laughs anyway. Frontier humour survived through stubbornness. A lesser-known detail from several western outposts mentions soldiers singing during patrols specifically to stay alert through freezing weather. Slow movement and silence sometimes increase the risk of exhaustion or dangerous drowsiness in extreme cold. Off-key singing apparently counted as survival strategy. That explains quite a lot. The man behind you begins humming a tune badly enough to frighten nearby wildlife permanently. As the patrol rounds another corner, you notice dim light glowing beneath one distant barracks window. Shadows move slowly inside. Someone remains awake mending clothing or tending the fire. The sight feels oddly comforting against the enormous dark beyond the walls. Human warmth reduced to a single square of light. For a moment, the storm softens slightly. Snow falls straighter now, drifting downward in calmer patterns. The sudden quiet feels almost suspicious after hours of roaring wind. The older guard beside you narrows his eyes immediately. He says storms often pause briefly before worsening again. Experienced frontiersmen learn to distrust easy moments. Weather across the plains and northern territories shifted unpredictably during winter months. A calm sky at dusk could become deadly before midnight. Likewise, violent storms occasionally vanished by morning without warning. Surviving journals disagree frequently about how accurately people predicted severe weather using clouds, wind patterns, or animal behavior. Nature preferred keeping its secrets. You continue along the wall while the cold settles deeper into your clothing. Your hands ache despite thick gloves. Your cheeks burn from exposure. Yet gradually another sensation appears beneath the discomfort. Alertness. Every sound matters here. The scrape of boots, the rattle of chains, the distant howl rolling across buried fields. Even the fort itself seems awake tonight. Timber walls creak softly in the wind while chimneys release long twisting streams of sparks into darkness overhead. At last the patrol returns toward the main gate. Lantern light glows warmer now after the freezing walk. The courtyard smells faintly of smoke and horse manure beneath the sharp scent of snow. Somewhere nearby, somebody opens a barracks door briefly, and laughter spills into the cold before vanishing again. Life continues stubbornly inside the walls. Outside, however, the snowstorm keeps moving across the frontier with endless, patient hunger. The storm grows gentler by morning, though nobody trusts it yet. Snow still falls steadily outside the fort walls, covering rooftops and wagon tracks beneath fresh white layers. The courtyard looks softer now, quieter. Even the usual sounds seem muffled beneath the heavy blanket covering everything. Inside the barracks, however, peace remains impossible. A child begins crying before sunrise. Then another. Then a third joins the performance enthusiastically, creating what feels less like distress and more like a coordinated musical rebellion against sleep itself. Several exhausted adults sit upright beneath blankets with expressions usually reserved for battlefield injuries. You cannot blame them. Frontier children endured winter storms differently than adults. Many feared the sounds more than the cold itself. Wind rattling shutters, snow sliding from rooftops, wolves howling beyond the walls, strange shadows shifting beside candlelight. For small children trapped inside crowded forts, storms transformed ordinary nights into enormous, frightening mysteries. You sit beside the fire while a young mother rocks her son slowly across her lap. The boy hides his face against her shoulder every time strong gusts shake the building. She hums softly, without pausing, though exhaustion darkens the skin beneath her eyes. Her movements feel automatic now. Experienced frontier mothers carried astonishing responsibilities during winter confinement. They cooked, cleaned, repaired clothing, comforted children, managed sickness, hauled water, and often assisted with livestock or food preparation as well. Many diaries written by travellers describe women inside frontier settlements as the true anchors holding isolated communities together. Watching this room, you understand exactly why. A kettle whistles sharply above the fire. Several sleepy children immediately drift closer toward the warmth while adults prepare breakfast. Tiny boots shuffle across the floorboards. Blankets drag behind them like little capes. One girl clutches a carved wooden horse missing half its tail. Toys remained rare in many frontier households. Children often played with handmade dolls, carved animals, smooth stones, scraps of cloth, or whatever objects adults could spare. During harsh winters, storytelling became one of the most valuable forms of entertainment available. You witness that firsthand near the rear bunks. An elderly trapper sits surrounded by children while describing a snowstorm from decades earlier that supposedly buried an entire cabin beneath drifts so high the family escaped through the chimney. The children stare at him with huge, fascinated eyes. One boy asks whether it truly happened. The old trapper pauses dramatically before answering, mostly. That feels like frontier honesty at its finest. The smell of porridge slowly replaces the scent of last night's smoke and damp wool. Bowls pass from hand to hand while tired adults encourage sleepy children to eat before the food cools. Outside the windows, snowflakes drift lazily through pale morning light. For a brief moment, the fort almost feels peaceful. Then somebody spills hot porridge directly into their lap. Chaos returns immediately. The unfortunate victim leaps upright, shouting, while nearby children burst into shocked laughter. One exhausted woman presses both hands against her face as though reconsidering every life decision that brought her to this frozen outpost. Honestly fair. A small but fascinating detail appears in several surviving frontier letters written by women during winter months. Many admitted missing silence more than comfort. Crowded forts created constant noise and endless interruptions. Some women reportedly hid briefly in storage rooms, simply to experience a few quiet minutes alone. You suddenly find that deeply understandable. Near the hearth, one little boy carefully traces shapes into frost gathered beside the wall. Another child attempts feeding crumbs to the fort cat despite repeated warnings from adults nearby. The cat accepts this tribute with complete confidence. Naturally, cats ruled frontier buildings with quiet authority. A traveller visiting a northern trading post once described children tying tiny strips of cloth around cats during winter festivals, transforming them into deeply unwilling holiday guests. Whether the cats appreciated this tradition remains undocumented, though. Common sense strongly suggests otherwise. You move closer toward the windows. Outside, soldiers shovel paths through the deepening drifts while snow continues falling steadily. Their figures appear blurred behind frosted glass. Every movement looks slower in winter, heavier somehow. Life inside the barracks mirrors that same rhythm. People pause often beside fires. Children nap unexpectedly against blankets or shoulders. Conversations drift lazily before fading into silence. Cold weather changes time itself. One mother near the doorway quietly braids her daughter's hair while explaining how to mend torn mittens properly. Nearby, another woman teaches two boys how to twist scraps of cloth into makeshift candle wicks. Survival skills pass gently between generations here, woven into ordinary moments beside the fire, not through lectures, through repetition. A number of historians continue debating how emotionally resilient frontier children truly became during these isolated winters. Some records describe remarkable toughness and independence at young ages. Others reveal deep loneliness, fear, and grief, hidden beneath practical routines. Childhood on the frontier likely shifted constantly between adventure and hardship depending upon the season, location, and sheer luck. The wind rises briefly again outside. Several children glance toward the walls immediately. One little girl asks in a whisper whether the storm can break the fort apart. Nobody answers immediately. Finally, the grey-haired trapper smiles softly and tells her the walls have survived worse weather than this. The child studies his face carefully before nodding with cautious acceptance. You suspect reassurance mattered as much as truth sometimes. Near midday, the younger children begin inventing games beside the bunks. One pretends to defend the fort against imaginary attackers using a wooden spoon as a rifle. Another wraps herself inside blankets and declares she is now a snow bear hunting for stolen biscuits. The adults barely react. Clearly this sort of nonsense happens regularly, yet even during play winter remains present everywhere. Wet mittens dry beside the fire. Snowmelt drips steadily near the doorway. Every few minutes someone feeds another log into the hearth to keep warmth alive against the endless cold outside. You sit quietly listening to the layered sounds around you. Soft humming, children laughing, wood crackling, wind brushing the walls, and beneath it all the strange comforting rhythm of people enduring winter together inside the isolated frontier fort. By late afternoon the fort settles into a slower rhythm again. Snow continues falling outside, but the storm has lost some of its earlier violence. Instead of sharp wind and sudden gusts, there is now a steady, almost patient drifting of white across the walls. The world beyond the palisade feels softened, as if wrapped in layers of quiet cotton. Inside the main hall, the fire has become the centre of everything. People naturally orbit around it. You notice how even conversations adjust their distance, growing louder near the edges of the room, and softer as they approach the warmth. Heat changes behaviour here. It pulls people inward, physically and socially, until the entire fort feels like a single breathing organism clustered around flame. A group of soldiers sits near the corner playing cards on a rough wooden crate. The deck is worn edges softened by years of use, and several cards bear stains from melted snow and spilled drink. One man slams a card down too hard, immediately accusing another of cheating. The accused responds with exaggerated innocence, while everyone else leans in with tired amusement. Arguments rarely escalated far in winter. Energy was too precious to waste. Instead, disputes became performance, a kind of routine theatre that passed time without real consequence. Moments later, the same men are sharing a tin cup of coffee and laughing at their own accusations. Nearby, a fiddler tunes an instrument that looks like it survived several wars. The strings sound uneven, slightly warped by humidity and cold, yet, when he begins playing, the melody fills the room with surprising warmth. It is not perfect music, it is something rougher, more human. A tune shaped by repetition, memory, and necessity rather than refinement. Several people begin tapping feet quietly. One woman hums along without fully realizing it. Music in frontier forts was never a luxury. It functioned like firewood for the mind. It kept spirits from collapsing inward during long confinement. Even poorly played songs carried more value than silence during weeks of isolation. You shift slightly closer to the warmth. The heat presses against your front while your back remains chilled, creating that familiar frontier imbalance where comfort never fully reaches the whole body at once. Someone passes behind you carrying a stack of damp logs, leaving a trail of cold air that lingers briefly before fading. A quieter corner of the hall draws your attention. Several traders sit around a low table examining worn ledgers and bundles of fur. Their movements are slower than the card players, more deliberate. Every exchange of goods feels carefully measured, as if uncertainty itself is part of the transaction. Frontier trade during winter depended heavily on trust. Transportation routes were unreliable, and shipments often arrived late or not at all. In many cases, people conducted business based on reputation alone, promising future payment when conditions improved. This created a fragile economy held together by memory and expectation. One trader suddenly laughs while pointing at a scribbled entry in his book. He claims a previous shipment of salt was recorded as arriving in good condition despite clearly dissolving into brine during transport. The others shrug, accepting the absurdity without much concern. Accuracy at this point in the season feels more like suggestion than requirement. You notice how fatigue affects everyone differently. Some people grow louder, others quieter. Some become more humorous, while others drift into long reflective silence, staring into the fire. Winter confinement does not create a single emotional response. It multiplies many different ones inside the same enclosed space. A soldier nearby stretches his arms and complains about stiffness in his shoulders. Another responds by suggesting they are lucky to be indoors at all. That simple statement shifts the mood briefly. Heads nod. A few people glance toward the windows where snow presses softly against the glass. Outside, visibility remains low, and the world beyond the fort feels distant and unreal. A sudden burst of laughter breaks from the opposite side of the room. One of the younger recruits has attempted to imitate the fiddler using a wooden spoon as a bow and a boot as a makeshift instrument. The result is chaos disguised as music. Still nobody stops him immediately. Amusement outweighs irritation. Moments like this mattered more than they seemed. Isolation wore down morale gradually rather than dramatically. Without small interruptions of humour or creativity, tension built quietly beneath daily routines. Fort commanders often encouraged informal entertainment precisely to prevent emotional exhaustion from turning into conflict. You lean back against a beam near the wall and observe the room more carefully. Every detail feels layered now. The overlapping conversations, the shifting warmth of firelight, the constant movement of bodies adjusting to cold and heat in cycles that never fully settle. Even silence here has texture. A woman nearby quietly sews a tear in a heavy coat while speaking to no one in particular about spring planting. Her words drift into the room without expectation of response, more like thoughts spoken aloud than conversation. People do that often during long winters. Speech becomes less about communication and more about maintaining mental continuity. Outside, snow briefly intensifies again, tapping faster against the walls. A few heads turn instinctively towards the sound, but no one appears alarmed. The storm has become part of the background now, like breathing or heartbeat. A faint smell of burning resin spreads as fresh logs are added to the fire. The flames rise higher, casting long shifting shadows across the timber walls. Those shadows make the room feel larger for a moment, as if the fort itself is expanding inward rather than holding back the world outside. You notice how the children respond immediately to the change in light. Their energy rises again. One begins chasing another between benches. A third wraps themselves in a blanket and declares themselves invisible. Adults glance over but allow it to continue. Discipline softens during long storms. Survival takes priority over order. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opens and closes with a dull thud. Cold air rushes briefly through the hallway before disappearing again. Someone curses softly about snow piling against the exterior storage doors. Another voice responds that it will only get worse before morning. That statement hangs in the air longer than expected. Nobody disputes it, because everyone already knows winter at a frontier fort was never a single event. It was a long accumulation of smaller hardships layered day after day. Each storm added weight, each night added fatigue, yet somehow life continued without stopping. You watch the fire for a while longer. The flames bend and rise, unaware of the world outside, steady despite everything pressing against the walls. In that motion there is something strangely reassuring. The storm continues, but so does everything inside. Night settles again without ceremony. The transition from evening to deep darkness feels less like a moment and more like a slow sinking. Lanterns are refilled one by one. Shadows stretch further across the fort corridors. The wind outside continues its patient work against the timber walls, brushing them with endless cold persistence. Inside the stables, the air changes completely. You step in and immediately feel the difference. It is warmer here, but also heavier, filled with the dense scent of hay, damp leather, animal breath, and old wood soaked through with years of use. Horses shift in their stalls, stamping occasionally as snowmelt drips from their coats. Their breathing is visible. Long, slow clouds of steam rise into the lantern light and disappear into the rafters above. Stable work never paused during storms. Animals still needed water feed and attention regardless of weather. In fact, winter made their care even more important, since a weakened horse could mean lost mobility for supply runs or emergency travel once conditions improved. You move carefully between stalls. The floor is uneven beneath your boots, packed earth, mixed with straw that has been crushed and reshaped countless times. A lantern swings slightly from a hook overhead, casting restless light across the animals. One horse turns its head toward you. Its eyes are calm but tired, reflecting faint orange glow from the lamp. Frost clings along the edges of its mane where melted snow has refrozen. You reach out slowly and brush it away, feeling the rough warmth of its coat beneath your fingers. A stable hand nearby speaks quietly. He mentions that during severe winters, horses sometimes shared body heat by standing unusually close together, forming tight clusters in the coldest nights. It is a simple behaviour, but one that could determine survival when temperatures drop too far. The man pauses to tighten a strap on the harness. His hands move automatically, shaped by repetition rather than thought. Like many frontier workers, he performs tasks with a kind of practical rhythm that remains steady even in exhaustion. Outside the stable, wind surges again. The sound reaches you through the thick wooden walls, muffled but still present, like a distant ocean pushing against cliffs. Snow shifts somewhere on the roof above, sliding in small, heavy layers. You leave the stable and step back into the courtyard. The contrast is immediate. Cold strikes your face sharply, a yin pulling warmth from your skin in seconds. Lanterns glow faintly along the paths, their light barely holding against the surrounding darkness. A group of men crosses the yard carrying water buckets. Their movements are slow and deliberate, careful not to slip on the thin ice forming near the wells. One of them jokes about how water has become more difficult to handle than gunpowder in winter, earning a few tired laughs. Small humour persists even here. A well-known reality of frontier life was that water management became a constant struggle during freezing months. Wells could partially freeze buckets, formed ice layers overnight, and melted snow needed careful filtering before use. Entire routines formed around simply keeping water usable. You follow the path toward the central hall again. The building glows brighter as you approach, warmth spilling out through the doorway before you even enter. Inside, the atmosphere has shifted slightly since earlier. People are quieter now, movements slower, conversations more fragmented. Fatigue is spreading. The fire still burns strongly, but the energy of the room has softened. You notice several people already lying down near the edges of the hall, wrapped in blankets and coats. Sleep arrives early during storms like this, not because people are fully rested, but because there is little else to do. A man sits alone near the hearth, sharpening a tool. The steady motion of metal against stone creates a rhythmic sound that blends into the background of the room. His face is partially illuminated by firelight expression, distant and focused. Nearby, a woman pours broth into small bowls without speaking. Her hands shake slightly from fatigue, though she continues with practiced efficiency. Every movement feels familiar, rehearsed through repetition across many similar nights. You take a seat closer to the fire again. Heat spreads slowly into your clothing, easing the sharp edge of the cold that clings to your sleeves. Sparks rise occasionally from the burning low, drifting upward before fading into darkness above. Someone begins telling a story from a previous winter. This one involves a supply wagon that became stuck for nearly a week during a storm, forcing travellers to ration food carefully while waiting for conditions to improve. The details shift slightly as the story is told, becoming more dramatic with each retelling. Nobody interrupts. Stories in frontier forts rarely aim for accuracy alone. They served as shared memory shaped by emotion, repetition, and survival. Over time, events became part fact and part interpretation, blended together into something that preserved meaning rather than precision. A young recruit listens closely. You notice how his posture changes as the story continues. Earlier in the day, he appeared restless and uncertain. Now he sits still, absorbing the experience of others as if it might prepare him for future storms. That is how knowledge often passed here. Not through formal teaching, but through shared recollection beside fires during long winter nights. Outside, the wind suddenly drops for a moment. The change is noticeable immediately. The walls stop groaning as loudly. Snowfall becomes softer against the structure. Even distant sounds from outside seem briefly muted. A few heads lift instinctively. Experienced residents do not celebrate calm too quickly. Everyone understands how quickly silence can shift back into violence when weather systems move unpredictably across open plains. You wait. The pause stretches longer than expected. Just when tension begins to ease, a low gust returns, brushing across the fort again, though less aggressively than before. No one reacts now. They simply adjust to it. That adaptation is perhaps the most important skill of all. Living here meant accepting instability as normal. Whether food supply, communication, and even safety could change without warning. The fort did not promise control, it only offered shelter from the worst of it. You lean back slightly against the wooden beam behind you. The fire continues its steady work. People continue settling into sleep. The storm continues outside without urgency or direction. Everything moves but slowly, as if the entire world has agreed to conserve energy. Eventually even conversation fades. Only the sound of fire remains. Sleep inside the fort arrives unevenly. It does not fall over the room like silence. Instead, it spreads in layers, touching some people quickly, while leaving others awake for longer stretches. The fire continues to crackle at the centre, casting soft, shifting light across bodies wrapped in blankets and coats. You remain near the warmth, half awake, half drifting. The floor beneath you feels harder now, as if the wood itself has cooled during the night. Nearby, someone exhales slowly in deep sleep, their breathing steady enough to become part of the room's rhythm. Another person turns over with a quiet rustle of fabric. Outside, the storm continues its slow persistence. Snow presses against the walls in steady waves. Occasionally, the wind rises, then lowers again, as if the weather itself is pacing back and forth across the frozen landscape. The sound is no longer frightening. It becomes familiar, almost background noise. A lantern near the doorway flickers weakly. Its flame struggles against drafts that slip through unseen cracks in the timber. Every time the light dips, shadows across the room deepen, then return again when the flame steadies. You notice how even sleep here feels conditioned. People do not fully relax the way they might in safer environments. Boots remain close, blankets are wrapped tightly, weapons lie within reach of bunks, even rest carries a layer of awareness. A soldier near the opposite wall murmurs something in his sleep. The words are unclear, but the tone suggests memory rather than fear. Dreams in isolated forts often blended daily experience with fragments of stress stories and anticipation of weather or duty. You shift slightly. The straw beneath your bedding crackles softly. A faint itch of cold travels along your shoulder, where fabric has loosened. You adjust your coat without fully opening your eyes. Near the fire, embers collapse inward. The sound is gentle but distinct, like something exhaling slowly before resting. A small wave of warmth spreads outward briefly before fading again to the larger chill of the room. Someone quietly adds another log. The motion is carefully practiced. No one speaks during it. The fire responds with a brief flare, then settles again into steady orange light. A memory surfaces in fragments. Earlier in the day, voices discussing routes, supplies, and distant settlements. The idea that beyond these walls the world continues moving without pause. That thought feels distant now, as if belonging to another version of time. A mainstream historical observation often drawn from frontier records is that sleep patterns in isolated forts shifted significantly during long winters. People slept in shorter intervals, waking frequently due to noise, cold, or habit. Yet they also compensated by resting whenever possible, creating an irregular rhythm shaped entirely by survival conditions. That idea feels visible here without needing explanation. You watch a woman across the room pull her blanket higher while still asleep, responding instinctively to a draft she cannot consciously feel. The body adapts even when awareness fades. Another detail emerges quietly in Mem. Some frontier accounts mention that storms occasionally trapped entire forts for extended periods, sometimes weeks, forcing communities into complete dependence on stored food and shared resources. During such time, routine mattered more than certainty. But not all stories agree on duration or intensity. Records differ widely depending on region, season, and who recorded them. Some descriptions suggest relatively manageable winters. Others describe near constant isolation and hardship. The truth likely shifts from fort to fort, shaped by geography and timing. You close your eyes again. The sound of wind remains constant outside, but it no longer demands attention. It becomes something your mind accepts without analysis, like breathing or heartbeat. A faint smell of smoke lingers in the air. Mixed with wool leather and cooked grain, it forms a scent that feels specific to this place alone. Not pleasant in any conventional sense, but deeply associated with safety within these walls. A child shifts somewhere nearby. A small whisper follows, then silence again. Even in sleep, presence is shared. No one is truly alone in this room even when consciousness fades. You think briefly about the structures themselves. Frontier forts varied widely in design. Some were simple wooden palisades with basic barracks. Others included storage buildings, workshops, and reinforced gates designed to withstand both human conflict and environmental pressure. Yet regardless of construction, all depended heavily on collective maintenance during winter. If the fire failed, everything became vulnerable. If supplies were mismanaged, isolation became dangerous quickly. If morale collapsed, survival became harder in subtle ways long before physical resources ran out. These thoughts drift gently rather than forming fully. The warmth near you remains steady even as sleep deepens again. Outside wind rises once more briefly, then fades. Snow continues its quiet accumulation against the walls. Inside the fort breathes slowly in darkness. Not peaceful exactly, not chaotic either. Something in between, shaped entirely by endurance. You let yourself drift further. The room, the fire, the storm all begin to blur at the edges. Only warmth remains clearly present. Morning does not arrive with clarity inside the fort. It seeps in, slowly diluted by clouds that refuse to lift fully. Light spreads across the courtyard in a muted grey tone, revealing new layers of snow that have reshaped everything overnight. Paths that existed yesterday are now softened, half erased and uncertain. Inside the main hall, movement begins again, not abruptly, more like a gradual returning of awareness. People rise from a blanket, stretch stiff limbs, and blink away sleep still clinging to their eyes. The fire has reduced to glowing embers, but warmth still lingers close to the hearth. Someone immediately kneels to rebuild it before the cold fully reclaims the room. You join the slow reawakening. Your body feels heavier than you remember, as if the night pressed extra weight into your muscles. The air is colder near the floor, warmer near the ceiling, creating a layered atmosphere that shifts as you move. Outside, the storm has weakened again, though it has not disappeared. Snow continues to fall, lightly drifting instead of rushing. The change transforms the entire fort's mood. People speak a little louder. Movements become more confident. Even the children appear less tense than they were during the night. A cook begins preparing morning broth. Steam rises quickly as frozen ingredients meet heat once again. The smell of salt-dried vegetables and wood smoke fills the room, replacing the damp scent of sleep and wool. Near the doorway, soldiers examine the outer courtyard. They push open the heavy door carefully, letting in a sudden burst of cold air. Snow has piled high against the entrance, forming soft barriers that must be cleared before anything else can function normally. One of them sighs deeply. Clearing snow is already becoming routine again. You step closer to the doorway, briefly peering outside. The world looks transformed. Snow blankets every surface in smooth, uninterrupted layers. The fort walls appear shorter, now partially buried by accumulation. A well-established historical pattern in frontier settlements shows that winter snow often reshaped daily logistics more than conflict or travel itself. Simple tasks like moving supplies or opening paths could consume hours of labour each day during heavy accumulation periods. Many forts developed organised snow-clearing rotations specifically for this reason. Out here, the truth feels obvious without explanation. A man nearby begins discussing storage conditions for grain and dried meat, noting how moisture from snowmelt often caused unexpected spoilage if not carefully managed. His tone suggests long experience with such problems. You notice how everyone speaks in practical terms this morning. Weather dictates conversation here. Another figure joins the discussion, mentioning that during particularly long winters, some outposts relied heavily on ration adjustments rather than full resupply, stretching provisions far beyond what would normally seem reasonable. The exact accuracy of such accounts varies depending on region and record keeper, but the underlying pattern remains consistent across many frontier reports. Isolation forced adaptation, and adaptation often meant uncomfortable compromise. You step away from the door as cold air seeps in again. Inside, warmth begins rebuilding as the fire regains strength. The room slowly transitions back into its daytime rhythm. Cooking resumes, tools are retrieved, blankets are folded or shaken out. Life reorganizes itself around survival tasks. A group gathers near the center table examining damaged equipment. Wet leather straps, frozen hinges and cracked wooden handles are laid out for repair. One man carefully warms a tool over the fire before attempting to reshape it. Another wraps cloth around his fingers to maintain grip. Every object here requires attention. Nothing functions independently for long in this climate. A small but interesting historical note appears in several frontier records describing how tool maintenance became almost as important as food preparation during winter seasons. Equipment failure in cold conditions could quickly escalate into serious survival risks, especially when transportation or hunting depended on functional gear. That becomes visible everywhere you look. A woman begins repairing torn blankets while speaking softly to a nearby child. Her movements are calm and deliberate. The child watches closely, absorbing each step without interruption. Learning here is constant and practical, not formal, not scheduled. It happens in fragments during daily work. Near the hearth, the fire now burns steadily again. Light spreads across the room with renewed warmth, pushing back the cold edges that linger near walls and windows. Someone begins humming again, this time more gently than before. The sound blends into the room rather than dominating it. People respond by settling into a calmer pace. Even conversation slows slightly, becoming more thoughtful than reactive. Outside, snow continues its quiet descent. The storm has not ended entirely. It has simply softened into something less aggressive, as if gathering strength elsewhere before deciding its next direction. You sit for a moment, observing the balance inside the fort. Warmth and cold, noise and silence, activity and rest. Everything exists in layered opposition, yet nothing feels unstable. The fort operates like a system constantly adjusting itself to external pressure. That realization lingers quietly. No one announces it. No one needs to. Life here already understands it instinctively. You take a breath and let the morning settle around you while the frontier world outside continues shifting slowly beneath the weight of winter. The day unfolds without urgency, as if the fort itself is still deciding how much energy to spend. Outside, the snow has stopped falling for the moment, leaving behind a pale brightness that reflects softly off every surface. The courtyard is now a maze of uneven drifts shaped by wind into shallow ridges and smooth valleys that did not exist yesterday. Work begins immediately. There is no hesitation. You follow a group of men stepping carefully into the courtyard, each carrying shovels and wooden planks meant for clearing paths between buildings. Every movement crunches sharply underfoot, the sound amplified by the stillness of the morning. Cold air bites your face again. It feels sharper after the warmth inside, as if the body needs time to remember how to exist in both environments. A line of soldiers works along the main path leading from the gate inward. They push snow in heavy arcs to the sides, building low walls that slowly grow taller with each pass. Their breathing becomes rhythmic, almost synchronized. One pauses to wipe frost from his eyelashes. Another jokes that they are slowly digging the fort back out of the world. Nobody disagrees. The work is slow but steady. Frontier forts relied heavily on this kind of repetitive labor during winter months. Without cleared paths, movement between essential buildings like kitchen stables and story could become impossible within hours after snowfall. You notice how the snow behaves differently in different areas. Near walls it piles unevenly, in open spaces it forms smoother blankets. Around doorways it compresses into hard-packed ridges, where constant foot traffic shapes it into temporary pathways. A small detail catches your attention. One section of the courtyard reveals faint outlines of yesterday's activity beneath thinner snow layers. Tracks from boots, sled marks, and scattered debris form ghost-like impressions that are already fading under new accumulation. It feels like reading a story being erased in real time. Nearby, a conversation unfolds between two workers about supply timing. One mentions that winter deliveries rarely arrive on schedule, often delayed by weather patterns that shift unpredictably across vast distances. The other replies that guessing arrival dates during storm season is closer to hope than planning. Their tone is not frustrated, just accepting. A more careful historical observation drawn from frontier records shows that winter logistics often depended on flexible expectations rather than strict schedules. Communities adapted to uncertainty by storing extra supplies during fall seasons and rationing carefully when delays stretched longer than expected. That strategy is visible in everything around you. You move toward the storage building, where a group is unloading barrels from a sled. The wood creaks under weight as frozen goods are transferred inside. Steam rises faintly from the animals pulling the load, their breath thick in the cold air. One horse snorts sharply and shakes snow from its mane. The handler pats its neck with gloved hands, speaking quietly in reassurance. Even animals become part of the winter system here, carefully managed and protected, because their strength determines mobility across frozen terrain. Inside the storage building, the temperature shifts slightly upward. It is still cold but less aggressive. Rows of supplies line the walls, barrels of salted meat, bundles of dried herbs, stacks of preserved grain wrapped in cloth, everything organized with practical precision. A clerk records inventory by lantern light. His handwriting looks slow and deliberate, shaped by cold fingers and dim illumination. Every item counted matters because loss or spoilage could have serious consequences later in the season. You help carry a small crate toward a shelf. It's heavier than expected, solid with frozen contents. When you set it down, a faint echo travels through the wooden floor, followed by a moment of silence. Outside voices rise again as more snow is cleared. The rhythm of the fort continues in cycles. Work outside, warmth inside, return and repeat, each phase blending into the next without sharp boundaries. Later, you find yourself back near the central hall where the fire has been rebuilt stronger than before. Smoke rises steadily through the chimney, now less scattered than last night. The room feels more stable, less chaotic. People move with practiced familiarity again. A woman near the hearth tells a quiet story while preparing cloth for sewing. Her voice remains soft, almost blended with the crackle of wood. She speaks about winter's past not as extraordinary events, but as remembered sequences of tasks, adjustments and small decisions that kept life moving forward. Nearby, a man repairs a broken chair leg using tools heated briefly near the fire to make the wood more pliable. Another adjusts a lantern wick, improving its brightness with careful trimming. Every action serves a purpose. Nothing is wasted. A lesser-known observation found in frontier correspondence suggests that long winter confinement often led to increased appreciation of small functional improvements. Even minor repairs or better lighting could significantly affect morale during extended isolation periods. That idea becomes visible in the smallest details of the room. People respond subtly to improved light, repaired objects, and organized space. Mood shifts quietly, not dramatically, but noticeably. You sit near the fire again and observe the pattern. Cold outside, warmth inside, work continuing in both directions. And beneath everything, the steady understanding that winter is not something endured once, but managed continuously in small repeated actions. The fort does not resist the season. It adapts to it. By midday, the fort feels like it has settled into a fragile balance again. The light outside is brighter now, though still filtered through a thin veil of cloud. Snow on the ground reflects it softly, creating a pale glow that makes the entire courtyard feel quieter than it should. Even the wind has reduced itself to occasional passing breaths instead of constant pressure. Inside the walls, conversation shifts into lower tones. Not out of fear, more out of habit. You find yourself near the main corridor where people move between buildings in slow, careful steps. The snow cleared earlier has already begun to return in small drifts along the edges of the paths, creeping back like it never left. A group of workers passes carrying repaired tools and bundled supplies. Their movements are coordinated without needing instruction. One holds a shovel, another carries a bundle of rope, a third balances a small crate against his shoulder, while walking carefully to avoid slipping on compressed ice. No one speaks much. Work creates its own rhythm. At the far end of the corridor, you notice a small gathering near the outer storage shed. A broken wagon wheel lies partially exposed beside stacked firewood. Two men examine it closely, discussing whether it can be repaired or will need replacing entirely. One runs a hand along the cracked wood. The surface is rough, splintered by cold and strain. He mutters that winter reveals weaknesses in everything, eventually including objects that seemed solid only months before. That idea lingers. A widely accepted understanding among frontier communities was that cold weather exposed structural flaws more quickly than warmer seasons. Wood-contracted metal became brittle, and tools that functioned normally in summer often failed unexpectedly during extreme cold. You watch as they attempt a temporary fix. Rope is wrapped tightly around the wheel to hold it together until more permanent repairs can be made. It is not elegant, but it is effective enough for survival purposes. Effectiveness matters more than appearance here. Near the shed, a horse stamps impatiently while waiting to be reattached to a sled. Its breath rises in steady clouds that dissolve quickly into the air. The handler pats its neck again, speaking in a calm voice that seems more for reassurance than instruction. You move closer briefly. The animal glances at you with quiet awareness before returning its attention forward. Frost still clings lightly along its mane, though the worst of the storm has passed. A small but meaningful historical pattern appears in many frontier accounts describing how animals were treated as essential partners during winter logistics rather than simple resources. Horses in particular were often prioritized for food and shelter even when human supplies were limited. That relationship is visible everywhere in the fort's daily routine. Back toward the center, a bell rings softly, signaling midday ration distribution. People begin gathering without urgency. Bowls and cups appear from various directions. The kitchen door opens repeatedly as warm food is passed out in steady rhythm. You join the line. The smell of stew reaches you again, familiar now, carrying the same combination of salt grain and slow-cooked vegetables. Steam curls upward from the pot in soft waves before disappearing into the cold air. A cook hands you a bowl without looking up. Her focus remains entirely on keeping distribution moving. Efficiency is the priority, especially when large groups depend on limited supplies during winter confinement. You step aside and eat slowly. Warmth spreads through your hands and chest almost immediately. Around you, people settle into small clusters while eating. Some sit on crates, others lean against walls. A few remain standing, watching the courtyard through half-frozen windows. Outside, snow continues drifting gently. Not heavily, not violently. Just steadily. A man nearby begins explaining how river crossings become unpredictable during winter, thaw cycles shifting between frozen stability and sudden melting conditions. His tone suggests experience rather than theory. Another listener nods while chewing slowly, absorbing the information without interruption. A subtle but important reality in frontier life was that environmental knowledge often came from accumulated observation rather than formal instruction. People learned patterns by surviving them repeatedly, sometimes over years. That knowledge becomes part of conversation here without being announced. After Isha, you return toward the central hall where activity continues at a steady pace. The fire has been maintained carefully throughout the morning, now burning with consistent strength. Light fills the room more evenly than earlier. Shadows soften around the edges, People appear less tense than during the night, though fatigue still shows in posture and movement. A few individuals lie resting near the walls, wrapped in blankets during short breaks between tasks. Near the hearth, someone is sharpening a blade again. The sound of stone against metal returns with rhythmic repetition, almost meditative. Nearby, a woman counts small cloth bundles, organising them into neat stacks for later use. Every task connects to another. Nothing exists in isolation. You sit down again and let the atmosphere settle around you. The fort continues functioning in its steady pattern, neither fully calm nor fully strained, but constantly adjusting to the presence of winter outside. Through the window, the sky remains pale and unmoving. Snow drifts gently across the courtyard, and life inside continues step by careful step within the walls that hold everything together. The afternoon light begins to soften again, sliding toward the pale edge of evening. Inside the fort, the rhythm of the day shifts without announcement. Tasks slow slightly, not because work is finished, but because energy itself feels more limited as daylight fades. People begin preparing for another long night, even though the storm outside remains relatively calm for now. You walk along the inner corridor where the walls are lined with hanging tools, spare ropes and bundled clothing. Everything has its place, not because it is beautiful, but because disorder becomes dangerous quickly in a place like this. When temperatures drop and visibility disappears outside, knowing where everything is stored can matter more than comfort. A group of women sits as near a wide wooden table, folding dry cloth into organised stacks. Their hands moved steadily, almost rhythmically. One speaks softly about repairing seams before the next heavy snowfall. Another checks the thickness of wool fabric by holding it briefly against the light, judging whether it will survive another week of cold. Their conversation feels practical and unhurried. Nearby, a man enters carrying a bundle of firewood already dusted with snow. He shakes it off before stacking it near the interior storage corner. A small cloud of frost rises and disappears into the warm air. You notice how often weather follows people indoors. Snow clings to clothing, boots, hair, and tools, becoming part of the interior environment for hours after entry. Nothing truly stays separate from the outside for long. A cook passes by with a tray of heated stones wrapped in cloth. They are being distributed to bunks again for warmth during rest periods. This simple method is mentioned in several frontier settlements as an efficient way to extend heat without constant fuel consumption. Stones retain warmth longer than cloth or metal alone, making them useful during prolonged cold nights. You continue deeper into the hall. The fire at the centre burns steadily now, more controlled than earlier. Its sound is quieter, less aggressive, as if the wood itself has learned to burn in a more stable rhythm. Smoke rises cleanly through the chimney. A man near the hearth is telling a story in a calm voice. He describes a winter journey along a frozen river where travellers followed animal tracks because visible paths had completely disappeared beneath snow. His hands trace invisible lines in the air as he speaks, mapping memory rather than geography. The listeners remain attentive, not because the story is extraordinary, but because it reflects shared experience. Many here have relied on similar instincts during storms, reading the land through indirect signs when direct visibility failed. A small observation drawn from numerous frontier records shows that navigation in winter often depended more on pattern recognition than fixed landmarks. Wind direction, tree spacing, animal movement, and even snow texture provided subtle guidance when roads vanished. These details rarely appear dramatic in the moment. They accumulate quietly into survival knowledge. At the far end of the room, a child sits beside an older man, learning how to mend a torn boot using thick thread and a needle heated briefly near the fire. The process requires patience, and the child mimics each step carefully. Mistakes are corrected gently. No frustration is shown. Skills pass through repetition rather than instruction. You sit for a moment and observe the wider space. People move in and out of light and shadow. Some rest, some work, some simply watch the fire. Every movement feels connected to the same underlying need to maintain stability within an unpredictable environment. A faint sound reaches the room from outside, wind brushing against wood, not strong now but persistent. Someone glances toward the window but says nothing. The habit of checking weather conditions becomes automatic during winter months. Even mild shifts can influence decisions for hours ahead. Near you, a soldier adjusts his coat and comments that the snow has begun to pack more tightly along the western wall again. Another replies that it will need clearing before nightfall, or the outer path will become unusable. The exchange is simple, practical, without concern. That practicality defines most conversations here. Even uncertainty becomes manageable when broken into small actions. A lesser-known detail preserved in frontier correspondence suggests that winter maintenance often created its own routine structure independent of formal schedules. People learn to respond to conditions rather than time-adapting activity to weather changes, rather than clocks. That pattern feels visible everywhere in the fort. Light shifts slightly again as clouds thicken overhead. The room grows dimmer, prompting someone to add fresh logs to the fire. Sparks rise briefly, then settle into steady glow once more. Warmth expands outward, pulling people closer without requiring instruction. You notice how naturally everyone responds. Movement toward heat happens almost unconsciously. Outside, snow continues falling lightly again. We are heavy, but steady enough to begin reshaping the courtyard for the night ahead. Inside the fort continues its quiet preparation. Repair, storage, food, rest, conversation. All layered together in a steady rhythm that has become second nature. You remain seated near the fire, observing the slow transition of the day as it folds gently into evening once more. Evening arrives without ceremony, only a gradual dimming of light through the frost-covered windows. The interior of the fort feels denser now, as if the walls have drawn closer together with the fading day. Lanterns are lit one by one along the corridors, creating warm pockets of light that contrast sharply with the cold blue shadows outside. You move toward the storage area where water barrels are kept. The air here is cooler again, separated from the central fire. Wooden barrels line the wall in careful rows, each marked with simple carvings indicating contents and usage. A few show thin layers of ice forming along their rims despite being stored indoors. Cold finds its way everywhere. A worker kneels beside one barrel, tapping the surface lightly before nodding to himself. The sound confirms partial freezing inside. He begins preparing tools to break the ice gently without damaging the container. Water management during winter is a constant concern. Every household and military post on the frontier face the same challenge. Liquids froze quickly if left unattended, and even stored water required frequent checking to ensure it remained usable. Small failures in attention could disrupt entire routines. You watch as the ice is carefully broken apart. Chunks fall into a separate bucket, clinking softly as they hit the bottom. Melted portions are then transferred to another container placed closer to heat. Nothing is wasted. Near the doorway, two people argue softly about whether tomorrow's snow will be heavier or lighter. Their disagreement is not heated. It feels more like shared speculation shaped by limited information. Weather prediction in frontier regions relied heavily on observation. Cloud thickness, wind direction, animal behavior, and changes in temperature all served as indicators. Yet even with the experience, accuracy remained uncertain. Conditions could shift quickly without visible warning. That uncertainty becomes part of daily thinking. You step back toward the central hall where dinner preparations are underway again. The fire is stronger now, reinforced with fresh logs that send sparks briefly upward before disappearing into the chimney. The smell of cooking returns, layered with smoke grain and salted meat. People gather more slowly this time. Fatigue is visible across faces and movements, shoulders sag slightly. Conversations occur in shorter bursts. The energy of the room is quieter than earlier in the day. A group of soldiers sits near the edge of the fire cleaning equipment. Knife straps and metal pieces are wiped carefully before being set aside. One of them pauses occasionally to warm his hands directly above the flames before returning to work. Maintenance never stops completely. Even in rest, preparation continues. A historical pattern observed across many frontier settlements shows that winter evenings often functioned as repair cycles. After daytime labor, communities use nighttime hours to fix tools, mend clothing, and prepare supplies for the following day. That rhythm creates continuity between exhaustion and readiness. Nearby, a woman distributes bowls of food again. Her movements are slower now, but still steady. She calls names quietly as people approach. The act is repetitive yet essential, ensuring everyone receives an equal portion. You accept a bowl and sit near the fire once more. The warmth spreads gradually through your hands before reaching deeper into your body. Around you, people eat in near silence, punctuated only by occasional conversation or the crackling of wood. Outside the windows, the sky darkens further. Snow begins falling again in thin streaks, not violent but persistent. Lantern light reflects softly off the courtyard, creating faint golden patches that shift with the wind. A man beside you mentions that the western supply shed will need reinforcement before morning. Another responds that it should hold unless the wind shifts again overnight. Their conversation fades quickly afterward. Everyone here speaks in terms of maintenance, weather, and readiness. Long-term planning becomes secondary to immediate conditions. You notice a quiet moment near the forewall. A small group sits together sharing a single lantern. They speak softly, their voices barely audible above the fire. The light flickers across their faces, creating brief moving shadows. Someone begins humming again. This time the melody is slower, almost absent-minded. It blends into the room rather than standing apart from it. Others nearby do not react, simply continuing their meals or repairs. The fort settles deeper into the evening. A subtle change occurs as more people prepare sleeping spaces. Blankets are arranged, bundles are adjusted, bunks are checked for drafts. Even the fire is managed carefully to maintain heat without overwhelming smoke. Balance is always the goal. Too much fire creates danger. Too little invites cold. You finish your meal and remain seated, watching the gradual transition of activity. The room becomes less active, more stationary. Movement slows, voices soften. Outside, the wind rises briefly again, brushing against the walls with a familiar steady pressure before easing once more. The fort does not react dramatically. It simply adjusts. Inside, life continues in smaller motions now. Final tasks before sleep. Final checks of warmth and supplies. Final moments of conversation before night deepens fully. You lean back and listen to the fire. It burns evenly now, steady and controlled, holding the interior against the growing cold beyond the walls. Night settles more completely this time, as if the fort finally accepts the weight of winter around it. The sounds inside grow softer, reduced to a steady background of breathing, faint movement, and the occasional crack of timber adjusting to temperature. Lanterns remain lit, but fewer in number, now leaving wider stretches of shadow between warm pockets of light. You remain near the fire longer than most. The heat has become familiar again, not overwhelming, just steady enough to hold back the cold that gathers along the edges of the room. Around you, people begin preparing for sleep in quiet coordination. Blankets are unfolded, boots are placed close to bunks, weapons are checked and set within reach. These actions are routine rather than urgent. Over time, they become automatic habits shaped by a repetition during long winters when preparedness mattered even during rest. A soldier near you tightens his coat before lying down fully. He exhales slowly, staring upward at the wooden beams overhead. His expression is calm, though tiredness sits heavily in his posture. After a few moments, his breathing begins to slow. Sleep arrives gradually again. Across the room, a small group continues speaking in low voices near the last active lantern. Their conversation drifts between personal stories, remembered routes, and distant places they hope to return to once the season ends. No one interrupts them. These late conversations often serve as emotional release rather than communication. They are not meant to resolve anything, only to keep thoughts from becoming too heavy in silence. A well-documented pattern in frontier life shows that nighttime discussions during winter confinement frequently centered on memory and anticipation. People revisited past journeys or imagined future movement beyond the fort walls, creating mental distance from present isolation. You listen without speaking. The words fade in and out as fatigue begins to settle more deeply. Outside, the wind moves again, briefly brushing across the walls with a steady rhythm. Snow continues falling, though more lightly now. The sound is distant and consistent, like something ongoing but no longer demanding attention. Near the fire, embers glow lower. Someone quietly adds a final log for the night, adjusting it carefully to avoid sudden flare. The flames respond with soft brightness before settling again into a stable glow. Light across the room shifts gently. Shadows become longer and more still. People begin lying down in earnest now, pulling blankets higher. The room transitions from activity to rest without formal signal. It simply happens as energy drains naturally from the space. You find a place near the edge of the firelight. The floor feels firmer again after a long day, though not uncomfortable. The heat reaches you in waves, fading slightly as distance increases from the hearth. Breathing around you becomes more uniform, slow, even, calming. Somewhere near the far wall, a faint cough breaks the silence before disappearing again into stillness. After that, no one moves for a long moment. A subtle but meaningful observation from multiple frontier journals describes how winter nights inside forts often produced a shared sense of compressed time. Days felt long and laborious, while nights became condensed into quiet stretches where activity ceased, but awareness remained lightly present. That sensation is present now. Time feels slower yet shorter at the same moment. You close your eyes briefly. The fire continues to crack softly nearby, though its sound is gentler now. Heat remains, but no longer dominates attention. Instead, it becomes background comfort. Outside, snow continues its quiet accumulation. The fort stands unchanged within it, surrounded by layers of winter that grow steadily through the night. Inside, people rest in uneven patterns. Some sleep deeply already. Others drift in and out of awareness. A few remain awake longer, watching embers or listening to the wind. Eventually, even those last wakeful figures settle. Silence spreads across the room in a soft, gradual wave. Not absolute silence, but something close, the kind that belongs to shared endurance rather than emptiness. You remain there resting beside the fire's fading glow, while the frontier night continues without interruption beyond the walls. The fort wakes slowly, but the outside world does not feel any closer today. Morning light returns in a pale, diluted form, filtered through clouds that refuse to fully lift. Snow still lies thick across the courtyard, now hardened slightly overnight into uneven crusts that crunch underfoot with every step. Inside, the air carries the familiar mix of smoke-damp wool and warmed stone. People begin moving again without announcement. There is no bell, no formal signal, just the gradual return of footsteps, voices, and the soft scraping of objects being gathered for another day of maintenance and survival. You find yourself near the central corridor where messages are usually delivered. A clerk stands beside a small wooden desk reviewing a stack of weathered papers. His fingers are slow from cold despite the fire nearby. Each sheet contains notes, inventory counts, or brief reports written in cramped handwriting. Information travels differently here. Not quickly, not reliably, but carefully preserved when it does arrive. A rider prepares near the outer gate. His horse is being checked for travel readiness, though the conditions outside remain uncertain. Snow still drifts lightly and visibility shifts constantly as clouds move overhead. The rider adjusts his coat repeatedly, ensuring no gaps remain where cold might enter. Travel in winter demands patience more than speed. Nearby, a small group discusses supply movement toward a secondary storage shed. The conversation is practical, focused on timing and accessibility. One man suggests delaying unnecessary transport until paths are more stable. Another argues that waiting too long could risk shortages. This kind of discussion happens often during frontier winters. Decisions rarely have perfect answers, only degrees of risk and necessity. You watch as they eventually agree on a cautious middle approach, not because it is ideal, but because it is workable. A well-established pattern in frontier settlements shows that winter decision-making frequently relied on compromise rather than certainty. Leaders and workers often prioritize flexible responses over rigid planning due to unpredictable weather and shifting conditions. That adaptability becomes visible in every small choice made here. You move toward the outer yard again. The snow has been partially cleared, but new accumulation already softens the edges of yesterday's work. The fort appears both maintained and constantly challenged, at the same time never fully settled. Two workers shovel quietly near the gate. Their movements are steady, repetitive. Each push of snow creates a brief path that quickly begins to blur again as flakes continue falling lightly. One of them pauses to rest, leaning on his shovel. He exhales slowly and looks across the white expanse beyond the walls. The landscape appears endless, featureless and slant except for wind moving across distant terrain. He says nothing for a while, then simply returns to work. Inside the fort again, activity continues in smaller clusters. Repairs are underway in several locations. A broken hinge is being replaced near a storage door. A torn sack is being stitched in the corner. A lantern wick is carefully trimmed to improve brightness. Everything receives attention eventually. Nothing is left unattended for long. Near the kitchen area, steam rises from boiling water as supplies are prepared for midday meals. The smell of grain and salt fills the corridor again, mixing with smoke from nearby fires. A woman carries a stack of bowls while speaking briefly to a child helping her. Her instructions are calm and precise. The child listens carefully, repeating steps with visible concentration. Tasks like this are part of early learning, here absorbed through participation rather than instruction alone. You notice how seamlessly people move between roles. Cook becomes teacher. Soldier becomes repairer. Child becomes helper. Roles shift depending on immediate need rather than fixed structure. Another small observation found in frontier records describes how winter environments often blurred occupational boundaries within isolated settlements. Survival required shared responsibility rather than strict division of labour, especially during extended storms. That idea feels present in every corner of the fort. You return toward the main hall where the fire has been rebuilt again for the day. Flames rise steadily, stronger than earlier. Heat spreads evenly across the room, drawing people inward as they take short breaks from work outside. Conversation remains low but steady. Someone mentions distant settlements and whether supply routes might open sooner than expected. Another replies that guessing is less important than being ready when it happens. You sit near the fire and listen. The room feels stable again, though not fully relaxed. Winter never allows complete ease here. There is always some level of readiness beneath rest. Outside, snow continues drifting gently. Not severe, not threatening, just persistent. The fort continues its cycle of adjustment, responding to every change in weather with quiet efficiency. You remain there for a moment, surrounded by warmth, while the world beyond the walls stays frozen in slow motion. By late afternoon, the fort feels neither fully active nor fully at rest. It exists somewhere in between, held in a steady balance that only winter can create. The snow outside has slowed again, drifting in thin veils that barely disturb the visibility beyond the walls. Inside, the rhythm changes into something softer. Less work now, more waiting. You notice small clusters of people forming in different corners of the hall. Some are repairing clothing, others are carving small pieces of wood. A few simply sit near the fire without speaking, watching the flames as if studying movement that requires no explanation. The atmosphere carries a quiet density, not heavy, just contained. A man near the far wall begins playing a simple tune on a worn flute. The sound is imperfect, slightly breathy, but it fills the space gently without demanding attention. Conversations gradually lower in volume as the melody continues. You find yourself listening without realizing it. Music in frontier forts often emerged during long winter confinement, not as performance, but as necessity. Instruments were shared, repaired, and played repeatedly, even when skill was limited. The purpose was not refinement, but emotional continuity. A small group near the fire begins tapping rhythm lightly against wooden crates. No one organizes it. It simply forms. A woman nearby laughs softly at something someone said, then returns to sewing, as if the laughter was part of the task itself. The line between work and rest becomes thinner during evenings like this. Outside, wind shifts again briefly. It presses against the walls with a low, steady force, then fades without fully leaving. Snow continues to accumulate quietly in places already cleared earlier in the day. A soldier enters from the outer corridor, brushing snow from his coat. He pauses near the fire for a moment, letting warmth return to his hands. His face is red from cold exposure, but his expression is calm. He mentions that visibility outside has improved slightly, though paths remain unstable. No one reacts strongly. Conditions improving does not change immediate reality. A well-documented tendency in isolated frontier communities is that small improvements in weather rarely altered daily routines right away. People continued acting based on accumulated uncertainty rather than momentary change. That cautious mindset is visible here. The flute continues playing softly. A child near the edge of the room begins tracing patterns in ash beside the hearth using a stick. Another watches closely, copying movements carefully. Their attention shifts easily between sound, light, and small physical actions. Near the storage wall, a man organizes tools into neat rows. Each item is checked before being placed back. Handles are tested. Edges are inspected. Nothing is left unexamined. Maintenance becomes almost meditative during long winters, a way to pass time while preserving function. You move slightly closer to the fire again. Heat surrounds you in steady waves. The earlier sharpness of cold is now distant, held outside the walls where it cannot reach directly. Conversation drifts in fragments around you. A story about a river crossing. A mention of lost supplies in a previous season. A brief argument over whether snow will harden overnight again. Nothing is resolved. Everything remains open. That is normal here. Some frontier accounts suggest that winter evenings inside isolated forts often created what could be described as shared idle states, where people were neither fully working nor fully resting but occupying a middle condition shaped by environment rather than intention. That description feels accurate in a quiet way. The flute stops for a moment. Silence expands briefly across the room before another small sound replaces it. The crackle of fire adjusting to a new log being added. Sparks rise upward and vanish into the chimney. You notice how many eyes briefly follow the sparks before returning to their own thoughts. Small movements become shared attention points. The fire. The door. The wind. Outside changes are felt collectively, even when no one speaks about them. As evening approaches, lanterns are lit earlier than before. The room shifts gradually into warmer tones as light spreads across walls and beams. Shadows become softer, less defined. People begin preparing for night again, but without urgency. Blankets are unfolded slowly. Sleeping areas are adjusted. Final tasks are completed without rush. The fort moves as one system responding to the predictable cycle. Winter outside remains unchanged in essence, but the interior adapts, continuously adjusting itself in response. You sit back and observe the steady rhythm. Sound, warmth, movement, silence, all layered together without conflict. The fire continues burning at the center, holding the room in its quiet balance as another winter evening settles across the frontier fort. The night that follows feels heavier than the ones before it. Not because the storm is stronger, but because the fort itself seems more aware of what winter is capable of doing. The wind outside has returned with a deeper tone, pressing against the timber walls in slow, deliberate surges. Inside, the fire burns lower than earlier. Not weak, just restrained. You notice how the room adjusts immediately. People move closer to the hearth. Blankets are pulled tighter. Conversations shorten until only brief exchanges remain between those still awake. The atmosphere tightens slightly. A soldier near the fire checks the door latch twice before sitting down again. Another quietly places extra wood within reach as if preparing for the something that has not yet arrived but might still come. Outside, snow begins falling again, this time in thicker clusters. Not chaotic, controlled but persistent. The sound against the walls grows more noticeable, like countless small taps layered together into a continuous whisper. The fort responds with subtle creaks, wood adjusting to temperature and pressure. You remain seated near the center of the room. Warmth still reaches you, though less evenly now as air currents shift through small openings. Shadows stretch longer across the floor. Lantern light flickers more frequently. A man nearby speaks quietly about the outer fence lining. He mentions drifting snow beginning to press against weaker sections again. Someone responds that reinforcement will have to wait until morning unless conditions worsen. The exchange ends without argument. Everyone understands limitations during nights like this. A practical reality of frontier winter life was that maintenance often paused during peak weather conditions, not due to lack of effort, but because visibility and safety constraints made certain tasks impossible until conditions improved. That limitation is accepted without resistance here. Near the far wall, a woman gently wakes a child who had fallen asleep sitting upright. She adjusts the blanket carefully before returning to her own place near the fire. The child stirs briefly, then settles again. Sleep arrives unevenly across the room. Some people drift into it quickly. Others remain partially awake for longer periods, listening to sounds from outside or watching the fire without focusing on anything in particular. A faint gust passes through the fort structure. Not strong enough to cause alarm, but enough to remind everyone of the world beyond the walls. Snow shifts along the roof above, sliding in uneven layers before settling again. You listen to the sound for a moment, then it fades. A well-known pattern observed in many frontier settlements is that during intense winter periods, people often became more sensitive to small environmental changes. Even minor shifts in wind or temperature could draw attention not out of fear, but from heightened awareness developed through experience. That awareness is present in the room without needing to be spoken. Someone adds another log to the fire. Flames respond immediately, rising briefly before stabilizing again. Light spreads outwards, softening the deeper shadows near the edges of the hall. A few people exhale quietly, almost in relief. Heat always changes perception here. A group near the center begins speaking in low voices again, discussing routes that might open once weather stabilizes. Their words remain cautious, shaped by uncertainty rather than expectation. No one interrupts them. Plans exist differently in winter. They are spoken softly, held lightly, and adjusted frequently. Outside, snowfall increases again. The pattern shifts from steady to slightly uneven, with occasional heavier bursts followed by brief pauses. The fort remains steady under it, absorbing the pressure without visible strain. You notice how the room itself feels more enclosed now. Not physically smaller, but psychologically closer. People occupy less space with movement, sounds become more deliberate. Even breathing seems quieter overall. Another soldier adjusts his position near the fire and pulls his coat higher around his neck. He stares into the flames for a long moment without speaking. Then he closes his eyes. Rest comes in fragments tonight. Not full sleep, not full wakefulness. Something in between. A quiet observation often found in frontier journals describes how extreme winter nights created layered rest states, where individuals cycled between awareness and sleep without clear separation. The environment did not allow deep detachment, only gradual drifting. That condition is visible across the room now. You remain still, watching the fire as it continues its steady work. Outside wind continues its slow pressure against the walls, never fully stopping, never fully intensifying beyond control. The fort holds, and everything inside adjusts around that simple fact. Morning arrives slowly again, but something feels different about it. The light filtering through the fort windows is sharper now, less muted than before. It catches on the edges of snow outside, making the courtyard glow in pale, almost reflective brightness. The storm has not disappeared entirely, but its weight has lessened. Inside the fort, the first movement of the day begins with unusual caution. People wake more carefully than usual, as if unsure how stable the world outside has become overnight. Blankets are folded slowly. Firewood is checked before being moved. Even conversation begins at a lower volume than normal. You step toward the doorway where cold air gathers. When it opens, the change is immediate. The wind is lighter. Not gone, but no longer pressing heavily against the structure. Snow still covers everything, yet its surface appears calmer, less constantly reshaped. Footprints from yesterday remain partially visible beneath thin new layers. The courtyard looks transformed again, but in a quieter way this time. A group of workers begins clearing paths without urgency. Their movements are steady rather than strained. Shovels scrape across snow in smooth arcs. Instead of fighting accumulation, they are simply reorganizing it. One man pauses and looks outward beyond the walls. The landscape is wide, uninterrupted, and pale under the winter sky. Distant tree lines appear faintly visible again, suggesting improved visibility compared to previous days. No one celebrates yet. Experience teaches restraint here. Weather patterns on the frontier often shifted in cycles rather than straight progression. A storm could weaken temporarily before returning later with renewed intensity. That uncertainty shaped how people interpreted even small improvements. You walk along the cleared path near the storage sheds. The air feels colder in a different way now. Less aggressive, more stable. It no longer bites sharply, but instead settles around the skin like a constant presence. Near the sheds, repairs continue on equipment damaged earlier in the storm. Ropes are replaced, wooden braces are reinforced, metal parts are checked for cracks caused by freezing temperatures. Everything is inspected carefully before being returned to use. A man nearby mentions that supply travel might be possible soon if conditions hold. Another responds that soon means very different things during winter. No one argues with that. Inside, the main hall activity has increased slightly. The fire burns brighter again, fueled by fresh logs brought in during the morning. Smoke rises cleanly through the chimney, suggesting improved airflow compared to earlier days. People gather around tables, preparing for the day's tasks. There is a noticeable shift in energy. Not excitement, more like cautious re-engagement. A woman sorts through stored clothing, separating items that need drying from those that require repair. A man cleans tools that have been set aside during the worst part of the storm. Another checks inventory records again, updating notes based on usage. You notice how much attention is still given to maintenance. Even with improved weather, nothing is considered resolved. A widely recognized pattern in frontier settlements shows that recovery after storms was often as labor-intensive as the storm itself. Clearing snow, repairing damage, and reorganizing supplies could take days even after weather improved significantly. That reality becomes visible in every corner of the fort. Outside, the sky shifts slightly brighter by midday. Clouds thin in patches, revealing pale blue tones that were absent during the storm's peak. Snow reflects this light, softly creating a calm atmosphere across the entire landscape. Children are allowed outside again in short intervals. They move cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realize the storm has truly weakened. Their laughter returns in small bursts carried lightly across the courtyard. Adults watch closely, but do not interrupt. Near the gate, guards examine the outer perimeter more thoroughly than before. They check drift patterns along the fence line. They test structural stability of the palisade where snow had pressed heavily. They note areas that will require attention later. Everything is recorded in small details. Nothing is assumed stable for long. Inside the fort, conversation becomes slightly more varied again. People begin discussing future plans in broader terms rather than immediate survival. Topics shift towards supply routes, seasonal movement, and preparation for continued winter cycles. You sit near the fire and observe quietly. The room feels different than it did 2 nights ago. Not transformed, but adjusted. The intensity of confinement has softened slightly, replaced by a more manageable rhythm. Yet winter remains present everywhere. In cold corners near the walls, in lingering snow at doorways, in the constant awareness of weather beyond control. A final observation often noted in frontier accounts describes how communities did not experience winter as a single event, but as a continuous negotiation between environment and human effort. Stability was never permanent, only maintained through repeated adjustment. That understanding is reflected in everything around you. The fort does not relax fully, it simply prepares differently now. Outside, the wind moves gently across the open land, and inside, life continues in steady, careful motion shaped by the lingering presence of winter and the quiet anticipation of whatever comes next. The final morning feels almost unfamiliar in its quietness. Not because everything is calm, but because the fort has learned the storm's rhythm well enough that fear no longer dominates every sound. The wind outside still moves across the plain, but it no longer presses aggressively against the walls. Snow remains everywhere, thick along the rooftops, packed into corners of the courtyard, softening the edges of every path that has been carved repeatedly over the past days. Inside, the fire burns with a steady confidence, now no longer struggling to survive, but simply existing as part of the room's natural order. People move with a different kind of ease, not relaxation, more like practiced acceptance. You notice it in small ways. The way someone leans against a wall without constantly checking the door. The way conversations continue without interruption, even when cold air slips briefly through open entrances. The way work resumes after pauses without complaint. It feels like the fort has adapted again. As it always does, a group near the center hall is already preparing supplies for future movement, stacking items with careful attention. Another group checks repaired equipment, testing durability after the long freeze. Life does not return to normal here. It returns to functional. You step outside once more. The courtyard is brighter today. Snow reflects the light with a softer glow, and the sky above shows wider openings between clouds. The storm that dominated everything days earlier now feels distant, almost like a memory embedded in the landscape. Boots crunch steadily as you walk. The sound is different from before, less urgent, more grounded, as if the ground itself has settled after long pressure. Near the gate, workers are already reinforcing sections of the palisade that showed stress during the storm. Their movements are measured, deliberate, without visible strain. One pauses and looks outward. The horizon is visible now in a way it has not been for several days. Trees stand more clearly in the distance. The wind still moves across them, but without the violent force of earlier storms. A quiet realization settles across the fort. The storm has passed through its strongest phase. Not permanently gone, but no longer dominating. Inside frontier life, this moment carried its own weight. It marked transition, not completion. Many historical accounts from isolated forts describe how the aftermath of storms often required as much attention as the storms themselves, sometimes even more as communities rebuilt order and restored systems disrupted by weather. That reality is visible everywhere you look. Snow is being cleared not just for passage but for stability. Supplies are being reorganized. Damaged sections are repaired carefully. Routines are re-established in preparation for whatever comes next in the winter cycle. You return inside for warmth. The fire greets you with steady heat. The room feels more open now, not physically changed, but emotionally less compressed. People sit in smaller clusters, speaking more freely than during the storm's peak. A woman laughs softly near the hearth while adjusting a repaired coat. A soldier stretches after long days of limited movement. A child runs briefly between benches before being gently guided back to calmer behavior. These small moments feel almost ordinary again. But nothing here is truly ordinary. Not in this place, not in this season. A final observation drawn from numerous frontier records describes how communities often experienced post-storm periods as phases of reconstruction rather than relief. The return of clearer weather did not signal rest, but renewed responsibility to repair, reorganize, and prepare for the next shift in conditions. That pattern surrounds you now. You sit near the fire one last time and watch the room in its steady motion. Outside, the frontier stretches wide and bright beneath thinning clouds. Inside, warmth holds everything together. People continue working, speaking, resting, and preparing without urgency, shaped by experience rather than expectation. The storm that once filled every sound has become something distant, not forgotten, just no longer in control. And as you sit there, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of the fort, it becomes clear that life here was never about escaping winter. It was about learning how to live inside it together, one careful day at a time. Sleep well,